Happy Friday, everybody. Every Friday, I like to go over a best of 3 sideboard guide, which is kind of an in-depth analysis of a specific archetype. And this week is Golgari Midrange, which has been exploding in popularity on the best of 3 tournament scene. So this week, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the Standard Challenge 32 winner from last Saturday. And so this one was running 2 copies of Duress, 4 copies of Cutdown, 1 copy of Bitter Triumph, 3 copies of the Caustic Bronco, 2 copies of the Go for the Throat, 4 copies of Mosswood Dread Knight, 3 copies of Graveyard Trespasser, Kervik the Punisher, 1 copy, Liliana of the Veil, Tranquil Frillback, 2 copies of Glissa Sunslayer, 2 copies of the Hostile Investigator, 2 copies of Archfiend of the Dross, 1 copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, 2 copies of Gix's Command, and 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist. And so ditching the Sentinel of the Nameless City and the Preacher of the Schism. And so we'll talk about whether or not that card is kind of missed here shortly. And for the sideboard, we've got 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse, 4 copies of Path of Peril, 1 copy of Tranquil Frillback, 1 copy of Duress, 1 copy of Extract the Truth, 1 copy of Tear Asunder, 1 copy of Cease and Desist, 1 copy of Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, which was usually included in the main and is being included in the sideboard here, 1 copy of Deadly Cover-Up, 1 copy of Cruelty of Gix, and 1 copy of Outrageous Robbery. So I'm going to hop over into the tracker data, and we can kind of see which cards are best in which matchups, and when we should be subbing out which cards for which alternatives. All right, welcome to my Golgari Midrange Best of 3 sideboard guide. Hope that this information will be useful for you if you are competing in the RCQ in Dallas this weekend, and hopefully it gets to you in time. So Golgari Midrange has definitely exploded in popularity, as I mentioned, and really the reason why Golgari Midrange fell out of the tournament scene was because of Domain, and because Temur Landfall combo or the Temur control deck kind of came into popularity, it kicked Domain out, which then allowed Golgari Midrange to come back in. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to march down the most popular decks according to MTG Goldfish, which is a third-party tracking website that looks into several RCQs and best of 3 tournaments, including the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. So the most common one right now in Outlaws of Thunder Junction has been Azorius Control, which is an uphill battle for Golgari Midrange, but still doable, especially because of Hostile Investigator, which was the new card that we got at Outlaws of Thunder Junction that is a built-in 3-for-1, so very good for the long game. We see Nissa Ascended Animist is doing well in this matchup too, which makes sense because Azorius Control can struggle outside of Get Lost against the other Planeswalkers, as long as you're good about playing around the counterspells. As far as sideboard options that we aren't running in the main that we could bring in against this matchup, we can see that Duress does pretty well, as well as Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal as a recurring threat. It is below 50% though. And then as far as the weaker cards in the list, we've got Bitter Triumph is not doing particularly well, and neither is the Archfiend of the Dross, which is more to pressure against mono red, as we'll see. And then we run into the problem of not having enough data in the tracker website Untapped, and what we can do is we can look at alternatives that other lists are running in Golgari, and for some alternatives that you could explore if you're having a difficult time against Azorius Control. And what we see is we've got Assassin's Trophy, we've got the Blossoming Tortoise, we've got Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, Shoot the Sheriff, and Sentinel of the Nameless City. So notably in this matchup, you might miss the Sentinel of the Nameless City a little bit and the value from the map tokens. And one of the things that's nice about the Sentinel of the Nameless City is that it has Vigilance so that it doesn't tap, which gets kind of plays around the Wandering Emperor. And then if we open things up to all archetypes, we can look at how the card is performing in every archetype instead of just in Golgari specifically. And if we do that, we can see that Outrageous Robbery is a pretty decent card against Azorius Control. And part of that could be a little bit boosted because Outrageous Robbery is typically played in the Dimir control lists and is kind of planning on milling out your opponent. Like Dimir control is like the control of control. And but anyway, it's in the sideboard and is probably an option that we could explore. And then as we go down further in the list, nothing really popping out except for Extract the Truth has no data, even in all archetypes. And so I think what the sideboard, or what the data suggests the sideboard should be, is to bring in the 1 copy of the Duress, as well as 1 copy of Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, and 1 copy of Outrageous Robbery, cut 1 Bitter Triumph and 2 Archfiend of the Dross, And Duress is a classic sideboard option against Azorius control, being able to hit their planeswalkers as well as their counterspells. Outlaws, as I mentioned, as long as it doesn't get exiled by No More Lies or some sort of counterspell that exiles, is a recurring threat. So once you get this down on the board, it can be very difficult for Azorius control to deal with, although Sunfall does exile it and get rid of it forever. And then Outrageous Robbery is really for milling out your opponent. This is a pretty grindy matchup, or at least it can be. And this also allows us to play cards from our opponent, so that helps us kind of outvalue the one-for-one trade that Azorius control is trying to win with. As far as the Bitter Triumph goes, it does hit Planeswalkers, so you can hit with the Wandering Emperor and Jace with it, but the data suggests that it's not particularly effective, and the Archfiend of the Dross is pretty easy to become problematic in Azorius control, because it can end up losing you the game if it runs out of oil counters, and is relatively easy to deal with counter spells, board wipes, etc. So next up on the list is Esper Midrange, is the second most common matchup, and usually you see these lists specifically from the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online are usually teched pretty heavily against Esper Midrange because it is a pretty common matchup. Here though, we can see that the Path of Perils that are in the sideboard would probably be good to bring in against the early threats of Esper Midrange, like the Fairy Mastermind and the Deep Cavern Bat, etc. And we can also see that Tranquil Frillback does relatively well in this matchup. And we've also can see that the Hostile Investigator, which is kind of for outvaluing our opponent, is not particularly good, because we're going to have a hard time keeping up with the card draw off of Rafine in Esper Midrange. And then Nissa Ascended Animist is not particularly strong, and neither is Kervek the Punisher, and neither is the Graveyard Hate of Graveyard Trespasser. And then we get into low data. But for the alternatives, we can see that Shoot the Sheriff could be a good one to explore for this one. Pillage the Bog, Preacher of the Schism, which is the other one that was the 3-drop that got removed, and Tiny Bones the Pickpocket. As far as all archetype data goes, we can see that Deadly Cover-Up looks like a relatively effective card against Esper Midrange. Notably, there is contradicting data for Aclazotz, and as I've mentioned before, I tend to lean off of the archetype-specific data, if it's available, before the all-archetype data, because there can, it can be boosted by an archetype that's good against Esper Midrange. And speaking of which, this deck is not particularly bad against the Esper midrange matchup. And then as we go on down the list here, nothing of particular interest, except for we do have no data, even in all archetypes, for Extract the Truth and Cease and Desist. So the the data I think suggested sideboard is to bring in the 4 copies of Path of Peril, and the 1 Tranquil Frillback, and the 1 Deadly Cover-Up. And to make room for this, we're going to cut out the 2 Hostile Investigators, the Nissa Ascended Animist, Kervik the Punisher, and 2 copies of the Graveyard Trespasser. And Path of Peril, again, being able to destroy everything with mana value 2 or less hits a good chunk of their deck outside of Rafine and a couple of their late game threats. Wiping the tokens off of the Wedding Announcement if they are running that version. And then Tranquil Frillback is something that we've kind of seen usually brought in against the pressure of like Mono Red or Dimir midrange, and or against Graveyard Hate. And since the Graveyard Trespasser is not particularly good in this matchup, it's not particularly good to attack your opponent's graveyard. You can get rid of a Dinnik, which I guess can be a recurring threat, but the more important thing for this is the destroying enchantments or the gaining 4 life, because they're going to really try to out-tempo us, and some lists run enchantments, some don't. Some of the Esper midrange will be running the Wedding Announcements and the Virtue of Loyalties. Really, we've seen kind of a split, depending after the Pro Tour, we saw some enchantment-less versions. If you're up against the enchantment-less version, then the Tranquil Frillback might not be as good. And then Deadly Cover-Up, being able to just hit it, have a reset button for the board and then collect Evidence 6 to get rid of every copy of Rafine in their deck is not a bad option to have. And then as far as the cards that we can pull, Hostile Investigator is really about outvaluing our opponent, especially through the card advantage. And Rafine's Connive is going to be difficult to keep up with in the first place. And then the 4/3 body doesn't really help us against the pressure that Esper midrange is bringing. Nissa Ascended Animist, the Planeswalker is just a little bit slow. It does have the recurring destroy target artifact or enchantment, and so we've actually seen Nissa Ascended Animist be a sideboard option against Esper midrange. Again, it depends depends on how heavily they're leaning into the enchantments. So keep an eye on that. If they are running like 4 copies of Wedding Announcement and 3 copies or 2 copies of Virtue of Loyalty, then you'll probably want to keep Nissa Ascended Animist in. And then Kaervek the Punisher is really for bringing back the black removal from your graveyard at the cost of life. And because of this being a matchup that is determined by tempo, it's not... we may not have the life to spend to be able to get the additional value out of replaying cards from our graveyard. And then Graveyard Trespasser, again, is better for the life gain and for graveyard hate. And although this can hit a Dinnick, it looks like it's one of the weaker cards in the deck. And you could also bring out an additional copy of Graveyard Trespasser for a Duress. I do think that that is supported in the data to attack the counter spells that Esper Midrange is running. But since Duress isn't a top performing card under all archetypes, I decided to leave it out. So I'll leave that one up to you if you'd like to include it. Third on the list is Golgari Midrange, and so we've gone from not even in the top 8 to number 3 on the list. And that's what I mean by Golgari Midrange has become very popular all of a sudden. And we can see here the top performing cards against the mirror match are Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, 4 Path of Perils, and the 1 Deadly Cover-Up, as well as 1 Terra Sunder. And as far as the weaker cards go, we can see that Kaervek the Punisher isn't particularly useful in this matchup, being able to recycle our black spells, and neither is the Hostile Investigator. The Caustic Bronco is actually pretty weak, and so are the 2 Archfiend of the Dross. And then we hit into no data. And as far as alternative strategies go, we do see that this is another match that would be good for the Assassin's Trophy, which is the thing that can eliminate a card of theirs, but at the cost of giving them a land. So it kind of helps them ramp. The Gitrog Ravenous Ride, which is one of the Outlaws of Thunder Junction cards that we got, specifically for the Golgari space. And then Virtue of Persistence, which was an old inclusion in some of the older lists of Golgari Midrange. We're deciding to run Virtue of Persistence. This one has dropped it. And as far as all archetypes go, we do see that Cease and Desist is above 50% and is probably good for this matchup. And then we hit into into the losing cards and then on down to where Extract the Truth has no data. And so I think that the data suggested sideboard guide here is to bring in Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, the 4 copies of Path of Peril, and the Deadly Cover-Up, and the Terra Sunder, and the Cease and Desist. And then drop the Kaervek the Punisher, the 2 Hostile Investigators, the 3 Caustic Broncos, and 2 Archfiend of the Dross. And so Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, again, is just a difficult one unless your opponent is able to exile it with a Terra Sunder. Acklazot's just keeps coming back. And then Path of Peril, if you remember last week, I was covering Teamer Control or Teamer Landfall, and I was trying to think why Vampire's Vengeance would be doing better against Golgari Midrange. And what I was thinking about was the old Golgari Midrange instead of the versions that have become more popular, which are running the lower drops of like Caustic Bronco. And so this is partly why your Caustic Bronco is going to want to come out, is because your opponent could be siding in Path of Peril to make the early part of the curve less relevant. If you're playing against the older version of Golgari Midrange, which are running more 3-drops like Preacher of the Schism and Sentinel of the Nameless City, then I don't think the Path of Peril looks as good. And then the Wrath Deadly Cover-Up, again, being able to just have that reset button is particularly good in the mid-range matchups. And Terra Sunder, being able to hit the Acklazots that your opponent is going to be bringing in, is particularly handy. And if they are running something like the Virtue of Persistence, then you can remove that. And then of all of the archetypes that actually has data for Cease and Desist, the Mirror Match is really the only one. And so being able to exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard and gain 2 life and draw a card kind of helps with just giving you that slight edge with the life gain against your opponent. And then it also makes Kaervek worse because then they won't be able to play the cards that you're removing with Cease. So Kaervek the Punisher can probably come out if you're in the mirror match, as well as 2 copies of the Hostile Investigator. Again, this one not really coming down to card advantage as much as it is just board presence. And so similarly, the dig off of Caustic Bronco quickly becomes something where the Caustic Bronco is somewhat of a outclassed card, and Archfiend of the Dross is relatively easy for black removal to deal with. Archfiend of the Dross, again, being in here really to pressure the mono red, as we'll get into. And Temur Control is the next one up on the list, which is the same thing as the Temur Landfall combo deck. So Duress allows us to attack the World Soul's Rage and the Virtue of Strength, and should probably be brought in. And Tranquil Frillback has the ability to destroy the enchantment of Virtue of Strength, as well as exiling their graveyard, which is super relevant in this matchup. And then as far as the weaker cards go, we can see that Bitter Triumph isn't particularly good. Most of the time against Golgari midrange, they'll be good enough to wait to do their Shigeki Loop and their Aftermath Analyst until they get up into a later amount of mana where instant speed removal doesn't disrupt it. If you're up against a worse player, though, then yeah, certainly you're going to want to keep that interaction. And then we've got Karavik the Punisher, again, not particularly impressive in this matchup. You don't need to be recycling your black removal with the limited amount of threats that Temur Control is actually running. And then we get into no data. And as far as alternatives go, we see that Shieldred's Edict is missing, and Pillage the Bog. So Shieldred's Edict is kind of an interesting one. I think maybe it's because it allows you to get around them playing like a protection spell, which isn't super common, but you do see occasionally lists running ways to protect them from removal, so that you can protect the Aftermath Analyst. And so Shieldred's Edict allows you to get around that. And then Pillage the Bog helps you dig for your graveyard removal, essentially, against Temur Control. And then as far as all archetypes go, we can see that the Graveyard Hate of Graveyard Trespasser is pretty relevant in this matchup. And then nothing else particularly stands out, except for there is contradicting data for Caustic Bronco. Again, I'm going to lean off of the Golgari specific data for this one. And then we get into missing data for Extract the Truth, Unlicensed Hearse, Archfiend of the Dross, and Cease and Desist. And this is one of those matchups where I think that the Unlicensed Hearse is a pretty big deal that it's missing from the data, because that's like your number one card that's brought in for Graveyard Hate. So I'm going to make an exception to the rule here and include the Unlicensed Hearse in my sideboard suggestions, even though it's not supported by the data. Other than that, though, I think we should be bringing in Duress and Tranquil Frillback and cutting out the Bitter Triumph, the Karavik the Punishers, and the 2 Glissa Sunslayers. Again, if you want to lean strictly on the data, then the Unlicensed Hearse isn't supported. So Duress, again, as I mentioned, is particularly good for removing the useful pieces from the Temur Landfall combo, and then Tranquil Frillback can attack the graveyard, and then Unlicensed Hearse can attack the graveyard, getting rid of the Landfall part of the combo. So Bitter Triumph, again, looking worse against an opponent that will actually wait until turn 6 to play the Aftermath Analyst, and Karavik the Punisher being kind of unnecessary to have additional removal, and can be pulled here. And then Glissa the Sunslayer is one of those that, like, it can destroy the Virtue of Strengths, but if your opponent has gotten to the Virtue of Strengths, then you're usually not in a great spot. So we can pull the Glissa Sunslayers. Now up for Boros Convoke, and here we can see Path of Peril. Usually anything that eliminates the early tokens is particularly good at Boros Convoke, so not surprised to see Path of Peril at the top of the list here. We can also see Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal does well for the archetype. This is a very difficult matchup for Golgari midrange, and then Tranquil Frillback can also be pretty good in this matchup. And the weaker cards are Nissa Ascended Animist, the Karavik the Punisher, Bitter Triumph, Duress, and Liliana of the Veil. And then we hit into no data. Alternatives, we do see Shieldred, not Shieldred the Apocalypse, but just good old Shieldred that makes them sacrifice, is the number one alternative list, but it does have a relatively low sample size. That one I found to be kind of surprising. Then we've also got the End, which makes a little bit more sense. We got the ability to remove their Knight Errant of Eos just permanently. And Insatiable Avarice, to be able to tutor. Sharp-Eyed Rookie, which is one we see more often in best of 1 lists, but this can kind of help stem the early pressure. And then Sentinel of the Nameless City is you're definitely going to miss that 4 toughness 3-drop that can pressure them with vigilance in this matchup. And then we get into all archetypes here, and we do see contradicting data for Karavik the Punisher. And I wonder this one a little bit about like being able to recur board wipes like Path of Peril with Karavik the Punisher. I think could kind of make it better. So it depends on how many Path of Perils that you're running. That might explain why it's really great in all archetypes compared to in Golgari mid-range where it's not as well performing. It might work better in Dimir Control, for example. And then we kind of just, on down the list, nothing of particular that popped out to me, other than Extract the Truth had no data. And so as far as against Boros Convoke, I think the strategy is to bring in the 4 copies of Path of Peril, the Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, and Tranquil Frillback, and the cuts are going to be to take out Nissa Ascended Animist, Kaervek the Punisher, and a Bitter Triumph, as well as 2 Duresses and a Liliana of the Veil. And Path of Peril, again, being able to wipe out everything with mana value 2 or less hits their entire deck except for the like Sanguine Evangelist and the Knight Errant of Eos, kind of the later end of the curve. But being able to remove all of those tokens that they've been producing off of the Gleeful Demolitions has proven to be a pretty effective strategy. And then Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal is one that can give us some additional life gain, and also 1/1s to kind of stay with them a little bit, being able to go wide with them. And Tranquil Frillback here, particularly good at destroying the enchantments of Case of the Gateway Express and War Leader's Call, or gaining 4 life to help you stabilize. Whereas the Nissa Ascended Animus is a little bit too slow to do the overrun aspect with the ultimate, and could do some recurring artifact or enchantment hate, but because Boros Convoke tends to be faster than Esper midrange, we usually don't see Nissa Ascended Animus being a particularly good sideboard option against their enchantments. And then Kaervek the Punisher, we're likely not to have enough life to be able to do the loop, although technically speaking with the Path of Perils, you might be able to get Kaervek to work. So if you'd like to keep it, by all means do. This is just a suggestion to help you build a sideboard strategy. And then Bitter Triumph, again, paying 3 life is not really an option here because we're going to be pressured for a life total. And there's not really a great target to hit with the Bitter Triumph in the first place, other than maybe a Knight Errant of Eos. And then, but they've already got the replacement value if they've convoked into that. So you usually want to try to get their board before they get the Knight Errant of Eos down. Duress looking particularly bad in this matchup, being able to only really hit the enchantments. And then Liliana of the Veil is also not particularly good in this matchup because making them sacrifice a 1/1 is not particularly effective, and the game is really going to be over most of the times before it comes down to the card advantage of making everybody discard a card each turn. So then the last one here is Mono Red Aggro, and for this one we can see that this is the reason why they're running the 2 Archfiends of the Dross, is that they must have been anticipating some Mono Red matchups. So keep that in mind in your tournament scene, how much you expect to see Mono Red, whether or not you think that those actually deserve a main boarded slot. Tranquil Frillback here, though, definitely should come in from the sideboard, the additional copy, and then the 4 Path of Perils, being able to hit their early pressure, as well as Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal can be a stabilizing force against the early pressure of Mono Red Aggro. And as far as our weakest cards, we're going to see the Hostile Investigator, again with that bad body, but card advantage. The faster the match, the worse off that Hostile Investigator is going to be. Nissa Ascended Animist, again, is also another card that usually comes in these slower matchups, and so good luck actually getting it down on the board before you're dead. And Glissa Sunslayer can be useful with the first strike, being able to block their attackers. The downside being that if they're able to get around Glissa Sunslayer with like a lightning bolt, then you're trading down a little bit for your 3-drop for their 2-drop. So I think it looks like one of the weaker cards that we could look to cut. And then Shieldred the Apocalypse is one that was kind of a classic one to include against Mono Red, but at 4, the meta has sped up so fast in Mono Red that you're going to have a hard time actually getting Shieldred the Apocalypse down a lot of the time. And then the life gain is incremental over time. So it's not as good as like Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, which will give you that 4/4 lifelink that immediately gains you life as soon as it hits the board, even though you do have to try to survive until turn 5. So no data. Then we hit into alternatives. We see Sharp-Eyed Rookie, also good against the early aggression of Mono Red. So if you are expecting a lot of Mono Red aggro or a lot of Boros Convoke, you may want to consider including Sharp-Eyed Rookies in the main. And this is something that you see more often in the lists designed to take advantage of the best of 1 meta, which is usually made up of Mono Red Prowess, Boros Convoke, and Azorius Control. And then Shoot the Sheriff and the End and Sentinel of the Nameless City would be good to alternatives to explore if you wanted to improve your win rate against Mono Red. And then we get into the all archetypes, and nothing really stands out here except for the Graveyard Trespasser at the top of the list. And that kind of makes sense because Mono Black is kind of the answer to Mono Red. So a lot of your black cards are going to have an increased win rate when you look at all archetypes. And then we get into below 50%, and then eventually down near the worst performing cards. A lot of the graveyard hate doesn't matter in mono red aggro. And then we've got Extract the Truth, again with no data. And so the sideboard strategy, I think, here is to bring in the additional copy of Tranquil Frillback, bring in the 4 copies of Path of Peril, bring in the Acklezot's Deepest Betrayal, cut the Hostile Investigator, the Nissa Ascended Animist, Glissa Sunslayer, and Shieldred the Apocalypse. And so Tranquil Frillback is a common one that we see a lot of times in the mid-range space, being able to blow up Kumanos while also being able to gain 4 life. Makes it pretty good against mono red. And then Path of Peril hits everything outside of Squee and Godric, and so is a pretty good option for eliminating a lot of their early threats. And then we get into Acklezot's Deepest Betrayal, and this one, I do have to admit, it is hard to say if Acklezot's is definitively better than Shieldred against mono red. But the data suggests that it is by 2%. And as I mentioned before, I do think that it comes down to the immediacy of getting the lifelink off of Acklezot's blocking on defense and being able to shut down the Slick Shot in the air, which is starting to see its way into more mono red lists. So as far as the weaker cards, again, Hostile Investigator, the bad body for the card advantage is just not relevant in this matchup. Nissa Ascended Animist, there's not enough enchantments to really want to target with Nissa, although they could be bringing in Urbrask's Forge in this matchup, which then would allow you to hit it with the Nissas. It's usually better to lean off of the Terra Sunders in that case. And then Glissa the Sunslayer, although it's a pretty good blocker, it's not a very good blocker if they're giving it evasion by doing damage with Slickshot or some sort of menace, etc. And then it also trades down to Lightning Bolt, as I mentioned. And then Shieldred the Apocalypse. If you really love Shieldred the Apocalypse and you can't imagine ever cutting it, I do think there is an argument to keep her in over Acklezot's, but I try to keep it as unbiased as possible and leaning towards what the data suggests. And so that's going to do it for my impressions of Golgari Midrange, or my sideboard guide for Golgari Midrange, giving you the top 6 most common matchups in the best of 3 tournament scene. And so I hope it was helpful. And at the end, I like to kind of do a wrap-up of what I personally took away from doing this process. And so we'll start off things with there's always going to be something that's missed in the data. A lot of times a card that's usually brought in as a sideboard in a very specific matchup just is going to have a very low sample size. And so I think that's where we see Extract the Truth was missing from the data. It's really Black's best option for enchantment hate, and I'm not necessarily convinced that it's better than just running a Terra Sunder, which kind of gives you the same thing, except for eliminates, the advantage of Extract the Truth is that it eliminates it from the hand before they get value out of it. So which can matter specifically in Esper midrange against like Wedding Announcement, where they can immediately get the card draw from attacking with 2 creatures. So I think that's probably why Extract the Truth was included, was to bring it in against Esper midrange and the enchantment heavy one. But again, that's speculation on my part because it's not in the data. Cruelty of Gix had an unimpressive stats below 50% in all 6 matchups, and there is very limited archetype specific data for Cruelty of Gix, so it is possible that the card is good, but the data doesn't really seem to suggest that, but again, that might be because it's better in this archetype specifically than it is elsewhere. And but I think I would play around with getting rid of the Cruelty of Gix in the sideboard. And Karavik the Punisher was also sided out in 4 out of the 6 matches. And it was kept in Azorius Control and Mono Red Aggro. And personally, I think that makes it more of a sideboard card than deserving a slot in the main, especially if since it was only kind of a mid-range card in Mono Red Aggro. It wasn't like one of the top cards against it, because you don't necessarily have that 2 life to replay everything. So I definitely play around with the idea of cutting Karavik the Punisher in the main and moving it to the sideboard, specifically to have a tool against Azorius Control. And then as far as some of the other options go, I think Shoot the Sheriff in the main is particularly appealing. It was in the top 10 cards for Esper midrange, Mono Red Aggro, and Azorius Control. And so I'd be playing around with the idea of taking Karavik out just for straight removal. And then Sharp-Eyed Rookie, The End, Assassin's Trophy, and Pillage the Bog could be alternatives to explore. So Sharp-Eyed Rookie was particularly good against Mono Red Aggro and Boros Convoke. So if you're coming up against those matches, might want to explore doing that. The End was particularly good at Mono Red Aggro and Boros Convoke. anything that kind of helps you get that pinpoint removal, especially with something that's a recurring threat or a key part of their strategy. So the end can get rid of Squee in mono-red aggro, and can get rid of the Knight Errant of Eos in Boros Convoke, or the Imidane's Recruiter, both kind of key to their strategy. And then Assassin's Trophy could be good, especially if you're looking at the mirror match or against against Azorius Control, which again was the most popular one in the tournament scene. So being able to remove one of their threats and give them a land is not necessarily the end of the world, depending on the matchup. And then Pillage the Bog was one where you could go look for the specific tool that you need, and that was particularly good against Esper midrange and Teamer Control, where you can it helps you find that piece of graveyard hate. So I know it's a lot to throw at you guys in like 30 minutes, but I try to keep things as quick as possible. And so remember to click like and subscribe if you like this sort of thing. I will be doing mono red aggro next week, and then we'll be kind of wrapping things up for Outlaws and Thunder Junction. And then I likely will not be back to doing this until we'll play around with the idea of maybe doing these again after rotation in the fourth quarter in September, or I guess August or September. Kind of depends on when they're going to bring out the set. So take care, everybody. Good luck with your RCQ in Dallas. If you are competing, let me know about it. I love hearing from you guys. And let me know if you have any other thoughts on this. You know, sometimes the data suggests something that seems way out of, way over on left field. And so I think sideboards always make interesting discussions. So if you have anything that you would like to add about a particular tech that you like against a certain matchup, I'd love to hear from you. And so take care, everybody, and good luck with your matches, and I'll catch you all later.